There's another part of Gnosticism that says, well, if the spirit is good and the body is bad, then why don't we just let the body do whatever it wants to? Oh, convenient, isn't it? Oh yeah, sure, eat whatever you want to. And do whatever else you want to do. I'll let your imagination wander. And they did. And it led to horrible immorality, which they could justify by saying, I'm feeding the immaterial part of me and letting the body do whatever it wants because it's going to do whatever it wants anyway. Okay. And Paul dismisses all this. Do not taste, do not handle, do not touch. He's saying they're ridiculous rules. They're petty opinions. They're human preferences that have been elevated to divine dictate. They will not make you any more spiritual. To believe that they would is a complete lie. And every religion, by the way, the reason why this seems like a good idea is every religion has this, what they call aesthetic kind of, if I do this, I'll become more spiritual. If I do these self-denial things, and that'll make me better. Christianity has it, Desert Fathers, people who just give up everything that even looked like luxury because they thought that those things were evil. You know what? God has told us to enjoy life, to enjoy the bounty of the good things that He's provided for us. So we've got to strike a balance there. What are two reasons why these rules are, in verse 21, are bad? He mentions this in verse 22. They refer to things that are destined to perish anyway. We're not talking about spiritual things. The food, the drink is not spiritual. Like Jesus said, it is not what goes into the man, it is what comes out of the man that makes him, that defiles him. They're not contributing to your spiritual growth. And the other thing is, again, they're in accordance with the commandments and teachings of men who don't know any more about spiritual growth than you and I do. And yeah, there's some wise people out there, but there's a big difference between wise people and the unsurpassable wisdom of God. There's still a huge gap there. He goes on in finally in verse 23 to kind of get to the point of the problem of legalism. And he says, and I think this is a very interesting concession, these are matters which, to be sure, have the appearance of wisdom. They look like they're, oh man, ooh, look at you, look how spiritual you are. It's all a facade. There's, in reality, no spiritual growth going on there. And look at the things he mentions again. He mentions self-made religion, and I've got a little note in your notes about that. This appearance of a religious system, when in reality there's no religious growth or life there. It's just a bunch of rules, human rules, that's not drawing us closer to God. There's humility. There's, there's all this kind of false humility going on with these people. And again, he mentions aphadia, the severe treatment of the body. Kind of like the prophets that Elijah was opposing on Mount Carmel. They thought that if they beat and bloodied themselves, that their gods would respond to them. It may look spiritual. It may look like, oh boy, there's someone who's really committed. There's no spiritual value there whatsoever. And that's basically what Paul says. He says, look, it looks wise. Verse 23, it looks like there's some wisdom there, like there's some religiosity there. In reality, look what he says at the end, they are of no value against fleshly indulgence. Now that's the negative way of saying it. The positive way of saying it is there's no value for spiritual growth. Remember back in 19 he says, if you're connected with Christ, you are growing with the growth of God. If you're basing your spiritual growth on your own rules, there's no spiritual growth there. There's no real potential for growth there. False teachers believed that their compelling religiosity was the key to salvation for these Colossian believers. But the false humility, the harsh treatment of the body was not fixing the inside. And it made me think about what Jesus said about the Pharisees. He calls them in what must have been about the biggest insult he possibly can. He said, you guys are really, really nice-looking tombs. Whitewashed, man, that looks slick. And you know what's inside? Death. It's not the external working its way in to make us more spiritual. It's what only God can do on the inside and working out. And you know what? When we read our Bible, that doesn't necessarily make us more godly. But God can use that to grow us spiritually. Reading our Bible every day at the same time every day, your 2 chapters, whatever, that can also be a form of me thinking that that is going to make me spiritual. You have to be very careful there. There's a fine line. And I think the bigger issue here is how we respond to one another. I hope this does. I'm going to tell you a silly illustration. I hope this doesn't offend anybody. But I had a guy. I preached at this church, for several years before a guy came up to me and said, Pastor, sometimes you use a word that pastors should not use, and the word I was using was, apparently once in a while, just kind of off the cuff, I said the word darn.
Oh, no.
Oh! It filled my heart.
Ladies, are you okay? And he said, well, Pastor, you know what that's a euphemism for. Yeah, I know what it's a euphemism for, but that's why we use euphemisms, because they're not the real word. They're just general. and at some point, you got to say, come on, this is just silly. Now, if you don't want to use the word, and for goodness sake, I won't repeat the word, but if you don't want to use the word, don't use the word. Don't tell me that I'm not spiritual because I'm using it. Okay. I have a funny attitude about my Bible, and I don't mean the Bible, I mean my Bible. I will put my Bible on the table in our living room, and then to my wife's consternation, I will then put my feet on the table in the living room. I will not let my feet touch my Bible. Okay. Martha, what else do I do with my Bible? It's never going to be on the floor. I'm hitting her cold on this. I never put my Bible on the floor. I just don't. I don't like doing that. And I never put another book on my Bible. Unless it's my Greek New Testament or my Hebrew Bible, then I can put it on my Bible. That's okay. And you say, Matt, that is ridiculous. You are just a complete hypocrite and a legalist. No, I'm not. Why? Because I'm not imposing it on you. It's just quirky little things that I do. You've probably seen by now I'm a little quirky. It's just things that I do. It's my way of expressing reverence for God's Word. I've never said to anyone else, you need to do it. I've never taken a passage, Psalm 119 that talks about revering God's Word and say, now let me tell you, this is how you need to revere God's Word. Don't put it on the floor. Don't put your feet near it. And I never will. Because that would be legalism. You know what? It is okay to have self-imposed restriction. In fact, let me tell you something. I think self-imposed restriction is something that we're desperately lacking in Christianity today. I really do. TV viewing, time on the internet, this, that, and the other. I'm already stepping on my own toes, so don't tell me I'm stepping on your toes. I'm already stepping on my own toes. It's okay to restrict yourself. Paul himself said, I beat my body daily to make it do what I want it to do. He doesn't say, now you got to do that too. But he says, these are the restrictions and the limitations I put on myself. You know what? This is the time for us as Christians to stand on firm principles and to not back down, whether it's about government, whether it's about the authority of God's Word, whether it's about marriage, whether it's about the deity of Christ, whether it's about how to raise your kids well. This is the time for Christians to stand on their convictions. Just be very, very careful you're not imposing your personal preferences on someone else. And don't let anyone impose their personal preferences on you. That's when you can say, listen, hey, that's cool. But It's not the way I feel like I express my spiritual faith. And if someone points their finger at you and says, you're just a legalist, you stop them. You say, wait, let's chill out. Let's talk about this. Let's get our definitions right. Let's use this as an opportunity to grow and not as an opportunity to have conflict. And let me just leave you with this. Just remember, whatever you do, whatever self-positions you put on yourself, spiritual growth comes from God. And it comes through connection with Christ. I'm sensing, I'm just appreciating in a renewed way how important that is. Let those other things go. Hold fast to Christ. Next week we'll get into Colossians 3, where he really has a fun time getting more specific. Now that he's talked about what is not spiritual growth, all the false folly of Colossians, that he's described in Colossians 2, he's pushed that out of the way and said, okay, we're done talking about nonsense, and we're done talking about all this silly stuff. And he says, let's talk about what Christian growth really looks like. And you know what? It's not a bunch of rules. It's not a bunch of laws. It's about establishing virtue in our lives, establishing loving relationships with others, and about enjoying the growth that we can experience, not through our connection to this person or that system or this set of rules, but by appreciating our connection to Christ. Stay connected to Christ.
Turn to number 188. Let's stand as we sing The Love of God.
Before you go, let me just reiterate